31 years old, drowning in nearly $4 million of debt, and standing ankle-deep in brackish water, Marcus Brennan believed his existence had reached its final chapter when he purchased a crumbling Marsh shack for $12. Yet underneath the deteriorating floorboards rested a corroded steel vault and a horrifying secret that influential men had murdered to protect. At the age of 30, Marcus Brennan possessed everything a young entrepreneur could desire. He served as the co-founder and chief executive officer of Summit Transport Solutions, a thriving technology freight startup operating from Dallas, Texas. He maneuvered a pristine midnight blue BMW through the city streets, resided in a luxury penthouse with sweeping views of the Trinity River, and had proposed to a woman whose engagement ring cost more than the average American's annual salary. 12 months later, by his 31st birthday, he found himself sleeping across the worn-back seat of a 1999 Toyota Camry with a spider-webbed windshield, gripping a wrinkled plastic shopping bag that contained the only possessions he had left in this world. The destruction of his life was not a gradual descent into poverty. It arrived like a guillotine blade, swift and merciless. His business partner, Derek Walsh, a man Marcus had known and trusted since their undergraduate years at the University of Texas, had been methodically siphoning millions of dollars into offshore shell corporations scattered across 3 continents. When federal auditors finally knocked on the company's glass doors, Derek had already vanished into the wind, having purchased a one-way ticket to a country with no extradition treaty with the United States. He abandoned behind him an expertly constructed paper trail that directed every accusation, every fraudulent transaction, directly toward Marcus. Marcus exhausted every remaining dollar hiring defense attorneys who charged obscene hourly rates. He managed to avoid imprisonment, but the avalanche of civil lawsuits and the catastrophic bankruptcy filing completely destroyed him financially. The banking institutions seized his penthouse, his vehicles, his investment portfolios, and even his grandmother's antique jewelry that he had preserved in a security deposit box for safekeeping. His fiancée departed the same afternoon his bank accounts were frozen by court order, packing her designer luggage in complete silence, never once meeting his desperate gaze. He stood officially, legally, and utterly ruined. He owed precisely $3.8 million in restitution payments and possessed absolutely zero viable methods to satisfy that debt. Desperation transforms a man's rational thinking into something unrecognizable. With exactly $97 remaining to his name, Marcus spent endless hours occupying a corner table in a public library in downtown New Orleans, scrolling obsessively through county tax foreclosure databases on a borrowed computer. He searched desperately for a miracle, some overlooked opportunity, but what he discovered instead was Lot 518 in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. The property listing was minimal, displaying only a single unfocused photograph showing a dense canopy of ancient trees. The parcel consisted of a 0.3-acre section of worthless, waterlogged land situated deep within the Pearl River Basin. The property taxes had remained unpaid since 1983. The opening bid for the tax deed sale was listed at $12. Not a single person had submitted a bid. Why would anyone waste their money? The land was completely inaccessible by any paved roadway, situated within a flood zone teeming with alligators, cottonmouth snakes, and disease-carrying mosquitoes. But to Marcus, drowning in debt and despair, it represented the only piece of earth on the planet he could possibly afford. It offered a location where nobody could locate him, where no process server could hand him another lawsuit, where he could silently determine how to reconstruct his shattered existence or perhaps end it entirely. He entered his debit card information into the online form with trembling fingers. The transaction processed successfully. For $12, Marcus Brennan became a property owner once again. The journey into Louisiana felt like traveling into another dimension, a suffocating blur of humidity and overwhelming despair. By the time he arrived at the coordinates displayed on his GPS device, the paved highway had long since transformed into crumbling asphalt, then loose gravel, then finally an overgrown logging trail that his deteriorating Camry simply could not navigate. He abandoned the vehicle on the edge of a dirt levee, secured his duffel bag across his shoulders, and hiked the final 3 miles into the dense, oppressive marsh. The atmosphere in the wetlands was thick and heavy, reeking of decomposing vegetation, sulfuric gases, and motionless water. Spanish moss draped from the towering cypress trees like tattered funeral shrouds. Mosquitoes attacked him in relentless swarms, biting through his sweat-drenched shirt. When he finally spotted the structure on lot 518, Marcus collapsed to his knees in the thick mud and released a sound somewhere between laughter and sobbing, a broken, manic noise that echoed through the empty wilderness. It was not a house by any reasonable definition. It barely qualified as shelter. The structure was a dilapidated, stilt-elevated shack constructed from rotting, moss-covered cypress boards. The corrugated tin roof had rusted into a sieve, sagging dangerously toward the center. More than half the windows had shattered long ago, and the front door dangled from a single protesting hinge. It appeared as though a strong wind might collapse the entire structure into kindling, but it belonged to him. Marcus climbed the unstable wooden steps, his boots making wet sounds on the decaying porch. Inside, the single room emanated an overpowering smell of mildew and animal waste. The floorboards had warped and softened, bending ominously under his weight. There existed no electrical service, no plumbing infrastructure, only a rusted cast iron wood stove positioned in the corner and the skeletal remains of a mattress frame. That evening, a powerful Gulf Coast thunderstorm descended upon the marsh. The rain pounded the tin roof with deafening force, and water streamed through the numerous gaps in the ceiling. Marcus huddled in the least wet corner of the shack, wrapped in a damp sleeping bag, shivering despite the oppressive heat that refused to dissipate. He had discovered rock bottom. He was 31 years old, a former millionaire, hiding inside a rotting box in the middle of absolute nowhere. As the storm continued its assault outside, the wind screamed through the trees, rattling the fragile walls. Marcus shifted his position, attempting to find comfort, and as he moved, his heavy work boot came down forcefully on a particularly deteriorated section of flooring. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the air. The rotten lumber gave way entirely. Marcus's leg plunged through the floor, scraping his shin painfully. He shouted in pain and surprise, grasping the edges of the hole to prevent himself from falling completely through the elevated structure. But when his boot struck the ground beneath the shack, it did not sink into the soft, yielding marsh mud as expected. Instead, it contacted something solid, something that produced an echo. The metallic clang rang out clearly. Marcus froze completely. He tapped his foot against the surface again deliberately. Clang, clang. It was definitely not wood. It was not stone or concrete. It sounded precisely like hollow, heavy-gauge steel, and it was positioned perfectly level in the earth directly beneath his rotting floorboards. Marcus barely experienced sleep that night. As soon as the gray, weak morning light penetrated through the broken windows, he was on his hands and knees, driven by frantic curiosity. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, humid fog drifting through the cypress trees. Using his bare hands and a hefty piece of firewood, Marcus began ripping at the destroyed floorboards. The wet, decomposed cypress splintered with surprising ease. Within roughly an hour, he had cleared a substantial opening in the center of the shack, exposing the ground approximately 4 feet below. He lowered himself down into the dark, confined crawl space. The smell of the earth was overwhelming, a mixture of wet decay and a strange metallic odor that seemed completely out of place in a marsh environment. He wiped away decades of accumulated filth, dead leaves, and sediment with his hands. Beneath the grime lay a massive square iron hatch, easily 5 feet across. Marcus stared at it in complete disbelief. The metal showed pitting and rust, but the structural integrity remained undeniable. This was not some improvised root cellar. This represented industrial-grade engineering, professional construction. Welded to the center of the hatch was a substantial latch mechanism secured by a bulky old-fashioned combination padlock. Why would anyone construct a reinforced steel hatch beneath a worthless shack in the middle of an uninhabitable flood zone? Adrenaline, sharp and intoxicating, surged through Marcus's veins. For the first time in over a year, the crushing weight of his bankruptcy vanished temporarily, replaced by an overwhelming, consuming curiosity. He climbed out of the crawlspace, ran through the mud to his abandoned Camry on the levee, and retrieved the only tool he possessed, a heavy, rusted crowbar from his trunk. By the time he returned to the shack, he was gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. But his eyes blazed with frantic energy. Breaking the padlock proved to be a grueling test of endurance and determination. The lock mechanism was seized by decades of corrosion, and the thick shackle was constructed from heavy-duty steel. Marcus wedged the crowbar into the curved portion of the lock and used a massive river stone as a makeshift hammer, bringing it down on the crowbar's handle with all his strength. Bang! 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 The impacts echoed through the marsh. His hands developed painful blisters. His knuckles split and bled, but he refused to stop. He channeled every ounce of rage at Derek Walsh, at the federal judge who froze his accounts, at his fiancée who abandoned him without a word, at the universe that had stripped him of his dignity and left him with nothing. With a final ear-splitting crack, the internal pins of the corroded padlock shattered completely. Marcus tossed the broken lock aside with satisfaction. He grasped the heavy latch handle with both hands, braced his boots against the iron plate for leverage, and pulled with everything he had. The hatch groaned in protest. The hinges shrieked, a sound reminiscent of a dying animal as the massive weight of the door fought against him. With a surge of desperate strength fueled by adrenaline, Marcus heaved it upward, flipping the heavy door back until it slammed into the dirt with a tremendous thud. A blast of cold, stale air rushed upward from the darkness below. Marcus coughed violently, waving his hand in front of his face. The air did not smell like the surrounding swamp. It smelled dry, dusty, and carried a faint odor of chemicals and ozone. It was the distinct smell of something that had been sealed away from the world for an extremely long time. He retrieved his smartphone, activating the flashlight feature. The beam cut through the oppressive gloom, revealing a flight of smooth, poured concrete stairs descending into the earth. Concrete, Marcus thought, a chill running down his spine despite the heat. The water table in the Louisiana wetlands sat mere inches below the surface. To pour a dry concrete bunker in this location meant someone had invested a staggering amount of money on waterproofing, deep foundation pylons, and industrial sealing. Millions of dollars of sophisticated engineering sat beneath a $12 shack. Taking a deep breath to steady his nerves, Marcus gripped his crowbar tightly and began his descent into the unknown. The stairs descended deep into the earth, perhaps 20 or 25 feet. The temperature dropped sharply, the sweltering marsh heat giving way to a bone-chilling coolness. At the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight beam swept across a surprisingly spacious room. It measured approximately 25 feet by 25 feet, lined entirely with thick concrete blocks. Marcus's light bounced off the walls, revealing chaotic, deeply unsettling details. Pinned to the concrete were yellowing, water-stained architectural blueprints. Marcus stepped closer, wiping away a thick layer of dust from the paper. They were schematic layouts for various regional banks scattered across New Orleans, Lafayette, and Houston, dated 1979. Red marker circled specific structural support beams, ventilation shafts, and security station locations. But it was what sat positioned at the far end of the room that made Marcus's blood run cold in his veins. Built directly into the back wall was a massive circular steel door. It was a genuine Mosler bank vault, complete with a heavy locking wheel, multiple combination dials, and an intricate maze of thick steel locking bolts. It was a door specifically designed to withstand dynamite, drilling equipment, and natural disasters. And slouched against the heavy steel wheel of the vault was a human skeleton, still dressed in the rotting remnants of clothing. Marcus stumbled backward involuntarily, dropping his crowbar with a loud clatter that echoed through the chamber. His heart hammered wildly against his ribs. The beam of his phone shook violently as he forced himself to look directly at the remains. The corpse had been positioned there for decades, that much was obvious. It was dressed in the rotting, tattered remnants of what had once been a high-end 1970s pinstripe suit. A faded silk tie hung loosely around the exposed cervical vertebrae. But the most horrifying detail was the skull itself. Dead center in the forehead was a neat circular hole with a jagged blown-out exit wound at the back of the cranium. This was not simply a hidden bunker. It was a tomb, a crime scene frozen in time. Panic urged Marcus to run immediately. He was a convicted bankrupt, hiding from the legal system in a rotting shack. The absolute last thing he needed was to be connected to a decades-old murder in an underground vault. If law enforcement discovered him down here, they would bury him under the jail without hesitation. He turned toward the stairs, preparing to flee, but the beam of his light caught something resting in the skeleton's lap. It was a thick leather-bound ledger, surprisingly well preserved in the dry, climate-controlled air of the bunker. Beside it lay a heavy, tarnished brass skeleton key. Marcus stopped in his tracks. His curiosity, fueled by a lifetime of calculated risks in the business world, overrode his terror. He stepped back toward the vault, moving carefully to avoid touching the bones, and reached for the leather ledger with trembling hands. The cover was embossed with the initials R.M. Marcus flipped the book open carefully. The pages were filled with meticulous handwritten accounting entries, dates ranging from 1975 to 1982, and an extensive list of names. But these were not just any random names. Marcus recognized some of them from his high society days in Texas. They were the fathers and grandfathers of some of the most powerful politicians, federal judges, and real estate tycoons in the American South. Next to each name were staggering dollar amounts and cryptic alphanumeric codes. He flipped to the very last page. The handwriting here was noticeably different from the rest. Frantic, jagged, and smeared with dark, rusted stains that Marcus immediately recognized as dried blood. September 22, 1982. They lied to all of us from the very beginning. We thought we were robbing the Lafayette Regional Trust for the bearer bonds, but that was merely a smokescreen, a distraction. The money was just bait. They wanted the Baton Rouge files, the blackmail material, the photographs, the evidence that could collapse the entire state government infrastructure. I realized too late what we had become involved in. They killed Thomas at the safe house in cold blood. I managed to get the files and the gold down to the Marsh bunker before they found me. I locked the files inside the Mosler vault. I swallowed the combination to protect it. But they tracked me here. I can hear the dogs out in the marsh searching. I can hear them walking on the floorboards above my head. If anyone ever finds this journal, know that Raymond Mitchell did not die a common thief. I died a loose end that knew too much. Do not open the vault under any circumstances. The gold will make you wealthy, but the files will get you killed without hesitation. They are still out there. They will never stop hunting for what is behind this door. Marcus stared at the blood-stained page, the words burning into his consciousness like a brand. He slowly lowered the book and looked up at the massive, impregnable steel vault door looming before him. He had come to the marsh to hide from his ruin, to escape the wreckage of his former life. But for $12, Marcus Brennan had not simply bought a piece of worthless land. He had bought his way into a 50-year-old conspiracy that had claimed lives. And as he stood in the freezing, dead silence of the bunker, a terrifying thought crossed his mind and refused to leave. If Raymond Mitchell had swallowed the combination to protect it, how was Marcus going to open the vault? And more importantly, who still owned the land surrounding Lot 518? Who was still watching? Marcus's heart raced with a rhythm that felt like a frantic percussion solo against his ribs. He was not just a man drowning in debt anymore. He was a man in possession of a ticking time bomb. The realization hit him with the weight of all the Louisiana soil above his head. The ledger in his hands was not just a diary or journal. It was a dossier, a detailed record of crimes that could destroy empires. He did not leave the bunker that night. He could not bring himself to. Fear was a paralyzing agent, but it was also a stimulant that kept his mind racing. He sat on the cool, damp concrete floor, the beam of his phone dimming gradually as the battery drained, and read every single word of Raymond Mitchell's descent into paranoia and madness. The ledger described in detail a group known only as the Syndicate of the Basin. It was not just a local criminal outfit or gang. It was an intergenerational pact between old money families in New Orleans and high-ranking officials in the state capital. They had exploited the 1970s economic instability to launder vast sums of dirty money through regional banks and credit unions. But the real currency was not money. It was leverage, blackmail, control. The files inside the vault were, according to Mitchell's increasingly frantic entries, photographic evidence of a systematic cover-up involving a massive land use scandal that had paved the way for the current industrial giants of the Gulf Coast. As the hours ticked by in the underground chamber, the eerie silence of the bunker was suddenly broken by a sound that made Marcus's blood freeze in his veins. A heavy thud from above, from inside the shack. Something substantial had stepped onto the floorboards of the structure. Marcus killed his phone light immediately. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating, heavy shroud that pressed against his eyes. He held his breath, his eyes straining uselessly against the blackness, his hands trembling as he clutched the ledger to his chest protectively. Creak. The floorboards above were groaning under weight. Someone or something was walking slowly, deliberately across the room directly above the open hatch. Then the sound stopped abruptly. Marcus waited in terror for the hatch to be approached, for the sound of boots on the concrete stairs, for a gunshot, for anything. 5 minutes passed in agonizing silence, then 10, then 30. Whatever had been walking on the floor above had apparently left. Marcus did not move a single muscle until the first rays of dawn filtered down weakly through the cracks in the hatch above. When he finally climbed out, his muscles stiff and aching, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, he found no footprints in the mud surrounding the shack. The storm had washed everything away, leaving the ground as smooth and featureless as glass. But there was a new mark on the front door of the shack, a small, precise notch carved into the weathered wood at eye level. A symbol he had definitely not seen yesterday. A circle with a cross carved through it. The warning was unmistakably clear. They were watching him. Marcus knew with certainty he could not stay at the shack. But he could not leave with the evidence either, not yet. He stuffed the ledger into a waterproof plastic bag he found in his trunk and buried it carefully beneath the massive roots of an ancient cypress tree, approximately 2 miles deep into the marsh, marking the location carefully in his mind. He took nothing with him but his phone and the crowbar. He drove to the nearest town, a desolate place called Marsh Point, barely more than a collection of buildings. He needed a connection. Someone with specific skills who could help him decrypt the ledger's cryptic codes without drawing dangerous attention. He remembered an old contact from his days in the tech industry. Diana Cross, a forensic data analyst who had been abruptly fired from a high-profile consulting firm for digging too deep into corporate secrets her employers wanted buried. He found her living in a cramped apartment above a used bookstore, her life as shattered and ruined as his own. "Marcus," she stared at him through the cracked door, her face pale with shock. "You are a ghost. Everyone said you were in the middle of a federal investigation, possibly in prison." "I am in the middle of something much worse than that, Diana," Marcus whispered urgently, sliding the ledger onto her cluttered desk. "I need you to tell me what is actually inside this. And I need to know why someone is still killing for it after all these years." Diana worked intensively for 2 full days, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards, cross-referencing databases and historical records. When she finally looked up from her screens, her expression was one of pure, unadulterated terror. "Marcus, you absolute idiot," she breathed, her voice shaking. "These codes, they are not account numbers at all. They are coordinates, land deed surveys. These properties are now the sites of the biggest data centers, energy refineries, and shipping ports in the entire South. This ledger is not just history. It is the deed to the entire power structure of the state. If this information goes public, every major political player from here to Baton Rouge loses absolutely everything. Their fortunes, their reputations, their freedom." Marcus and Diana realized the trap they were caught in. They were not just being hunted. They were being baited, drawn out. The syndicate knew someone had found the shack. They were waiting patiently for Marcus to return, waiting for him to attempt to open the vault, waiting for him to make a fatal mistake. But Marcus was a strategist, a businessman trained to think several moves ahead. He realized the only way to survive was to control the narrative, to turn the tables. They returned to the marsh under the cover of a dense, humid night, the darkness thick as velvet. Marcus did not just want the gold. He needed the files to trade for his life, for leverage. But there remained the seemingly impossible problem of the combination. Raymond Mitchell had swallowed it to keep it secret. "He was a thief and a criminal," Diana whispered as they stood over the skeleton in the underground chamber, "but he was not a poet or a martyr. He did not swallow it. He recorded it somewhere safer." Diana knelt carefully by the skeleton, her flashlight beam scanning the bones methodically. She noticed a faint etched marking on the inside of the skeleton's ring finger. A thin gold band sat there, so worn and tarnished it almost looked like part of the bone itself. "The combination is not written in the book, Marcus. It is engraved on his hand, on the ring." They carefully removed the ring from the skeletal finger. It was a custom signet ring with a series of tiny laser-etched numbers on the inner band, barely visible. Marcus stepped up to the mosselaar vault with the ring in his palm. His hands were steady now, remarkably calm. He felt a strange, chilling connection to the dead man, to Raymond Mitchell who had died protecting these secrets. He began to dial the numbers carefully. Click, click, clack. The tension in the room was electric, the air itself seeming to vibrate. With the final turn, the heavy internal tumblers groaned, a sound of industrial metal sliding precisely against metal. The massive vault door began to swing outward slowly, ponderously. It was not filled with gold bars as Marcus had half expected. It was filled with boxes, thousands of microfiche slides, thick stacks of Polaroid photographs, and hundreds of cassette tapes, all meticulously organized. And at the very back, sitting alone, a small black velvet bag. Marcus opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were not coins, but diamonds, raw and uncut, and worth enough to buy a small nation. But as he reached for the files, a voice boomed from the stairs, echoing through the chamber. "Careful, Mr. Brennan. That is a very heavy legacy to carry." Marcus spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Standing at the bottom of the stairs, backlit by the dim light from above, was Derek Walsh, his former partner, the man who had ruined his life. He was flanked by two men in dark tactical gear, their faces obscured. Derek, Marcus's voice was hollow, barely recognizable as his own. "I did not steal the money, Marcus," Derek said, his voice cold and devoid of any warmth or familiarity. "I was an operative, a paid contractor. I was tasked with cleaning up the loose ends of the syndicate, tying up decades-old problems. I needed you specifically to find this place. I needed you to open this door. You were the only one with the credentials to access the estate's legal holding after the original families wanted distance from it." Marcus looked at the files in the vault, decades of evidence. He looked at Diana, who stood frozen in the corner, her face white with fear. He realized with stunning clarity that the entire bankruptcy, the elaborate setup, the financial ruin, it had all been a long game to lead him precisely to this Marsh, to this moment. "You want the files, Derek?" Marcus asked, his voice becoming steady, cold. "I want the files," Derek replied simply, "and then you can go back to being a ghost, a forgotten bankrupt. Nobody will look for you." Marcus smiled slowly. It was a cold, dangerous expression that Derek had never seen on his former partner's face before. "Diana, send it now." Diana pressed a single button on her tablet computer without hesitation. "What did you just do?" Derek stepped forward aggressively, his face twitching with anger and sudden fear. "I am a tech guy, Derek," Marcus said calmly. "Before I came here tonight, I set up an automated deadman switch, a failsafe. If I do not check in with a secure server every 6 hours with a specific code, the complete contents of these files, every scan, every name, every coordinate, every photograph gets uploaded simultaneously to the FBI, the local press, and every major news outlet in the country. The files are already scanned and queued." Derek paled visibly, his confidence evaporating. "You are bluffing. You would not dare." "Try me and find out," Marcus replied. "We have exactly 4 minutes before the first upload hits the wire and goes live. You kill us, the world finds out everything within minutes. You let us walk out of here, and we just might keep the names off the front page. We might be willing to negotiate terms." The standoff lasted an eternity, the silence broken only by the hum of the underground ventilation system, the drip of condensation from the ceiling, the sound of their own breathing. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into seconds, Derek lowered his hand in a gesture of surrender. "You think you have won?" Derek spat bitterly. "You are still a pauper, Marcus. Still a ruined man. And you are still a marked man. The syndicate does not forget." "Maybe so," Marcus said, grabbing the bag of diamonds and pulling Diana firmly toward the stairs, never taking his eyes off Derek. "But I am a free pauper with insurance, and you? You have 4 minutes to find a place to hide before your employers find out you failed." They did not look back. They scrambled up the stairs, out into the humid night air, and did not stop running until they reached the highway where Diana's car was hidden. Marcus Brennan did not become a billionaire from the diamonds. He did not return to the penthouse lifestyle or the luxury vehicles. He disappeared completely and intentionally, taking the diamonds and a carefully selected fraction of the files as his leverage, his insurance policy. He lived in the shadows, a ghost in the machine, constantly moving, ensuring the files were never deleted, always ready to release them if the wrong people started moving too close to him or Diana. The $12 Marsh shack was burned to the ground that very night, taking the physical secrets of the dead with it, the skeleton of Raymond Mitchell finally cremated. But the war for the truth had only just begun, and Marcus knew it. Marcus learned through painful experience that some treasures are not meant to be spent frivolously. Some are meant to be held over the heads of the monsters who think they own the world, who believe they are untouchable. Marcus Brennan's journey from the heights of wealth and success to the depths of the Marsh proves that the greatest fortunes are often hidden where we least expect them, in the places nobody thinks to look. But at what cost does the truth come to light? What price must be paid? This is only the beginning of a much larger web of deception that stretches across decades. The syndicate is still out there, still powerful, still watching. If you want to see the leaked documents or follow the next chapter of this investigation, hit that like button, share this story with everyone you know, and subscribe for the full terrifying truth that they don't want you to know.